It just was weird to me. But gradually I began to believe there was no God. It just seemed logical. There's no God because he can't be experienced. And the only real things are things that can be experienced. There's a philosophical term called Occam's razor, which basically says no point in hypothesizing existent realities if the hypothesis is not needed in order to explain or make sense of present experience. I didn't need God to make sense of present experience. I saw no reason to hypothesize the existence of God. So gradually I quit believing in God. Anyway, my childhood began to come to an end. I had some sort of strange things that happened to me there in childhood. One was I had these experiences, and I don't quite know how to describe them, but the best I can describe them is it was like the shakes. These terrible things would start happening to me, and I would just start shaking violently, and horrible feelings would be blasting through my body, and I would be so anxious and nervous that I could hardly function, and the pain would get so intense that I would start crying. And I was just I was just so anxious all the time. Every time I'd take a test, I'd get really anxious. I learned soon that I could do just about as well trying hard on a test as not trying hard on a test. In fact, I took this math test one time. I really wanted to do well on it, and I just messed it up. And then they came around and gave the test. It was some sort of national math exam. They gave it the next year. I decided I was just going to play with it. So I played with it and scored one of the highest in the school. Anyway, I would get the shakes, and my mom would be holding on to me, and I don't know what that was about, but that was painful and kind of scary. I started sleeping a little better, however. I was happy about that. The plate glass feeling became even more intense. I had this final confrontation with my dad. I guess I was about 15 when that happened. I wanted to get a haircut at a barbershop because kids were making fun of our haircuts because Dad would just mess them up every time he cut our hair. He got his haircut at the barbershop. I wanted to get a haircut. He wouldn't let me. One of my friends said he'd cut my hair for 25 cents. He wouldn't let me do that. So I really pushed hard to get that haircut, and he simply refused. And so after that, I decided I would never, ever ask him for anything ever again. And I pretty much stuck by that. Not fully, I mean, almost never ask him for anything. I've had a lot of difficulties where a little help from my folks would have been really appreciated, and I didn't ask for it. I remember my mom helped me. She proofread my PhD dissertation in systematic theology. But essentially, I just cut off relationships just like that with him. I mean, that was that. I never asked him for anything again, except one little exception. Anyway, it came time to leave home. I applied to a place called Sewanee. I got in early admittance, and end of the summer came, my last summer at home, and my dad bought me a ticket on the Greyhound bus line, and the day came to leave, and my mom drove me downtown Kansas City for me to get on the bus. And we drove up to the curb, and I opened the door and got out. The car was still running, and she leaned across the seat and looked at me and said something like, "Well, Rob, I guess you're going to be okay. We really had our doubts about it." I said, "Okay, Mom, bye," and shut the door, and she drove off. And those were essentially the last words for my folks for my childhood. There was one other thing in my childhood that was very important that I have left out heretofore, that began to interest me very intensely. And that is, I all along from time to time would have these intense feelings of sorrow and loss. I had those feelings when I sang that song, "I had a home one time, I left it all behind, and I go back home if I could clear my mind." But I used to sit at the piano. My parents wanted me to learn how to play piano. I was a terrible piano player. Jack was a very good piano player, but I was terrible. And I would just sing "Long, Long Ago" over, and I'd play it over and over again. "Sing me the songs I delighted to hear long, long ago, long, long ago. Tell me the tales that to me were so dear, long, long ago, long ago. And when I would play it, I would just feel this intense sense of loss and longing. And there were other experiences like that. I remember one time in Kansas, boy, we had some great weather out there. I loved beauty. I'd run up to when the sun was setting. We lived in eastern Kansas, south of Kansas City. There were some hills there. I'd run up to the top of the hills, up the top of the hill west of us when the sun was setting, just to watch the sun go down, just to see the sunset. And we had some great storms. I remember one came in from the west one time, just blew in, monster. And these huge clouds would come roaring in. And the wind would blow really hard, and the lightning would flash, and the rain would descend like a deluge, and then it would be gone. And then it would just roll by. And I remember I was inside the house, but as soon as it rolled by, I ran out. I was barefooted. I had almost nothing on except a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. It was the summertime, and I ran down the little hill toward the chicken house, out past the barn, out to the back lot on the top of the hill, and I looked over in the west, and the sun was shining through the clouds. It was about 5 in the afternoon. And I looked to the east, and there was this line of birch trees, and their leaves were turned up in the wind, and the sun was shining on the bottoms of the birch leaves, and they were shining silver in the wind, in the sun. And I looked up at the sky, and I was filled with ecstasy. Now, those experiences, and there were many that I have left out, not a many, but there were a number of them that I left out, made a deep impression on me. And I began to think to myself, what is it I'm longing for? And I had no answer. Anyway, I got to Swanee, and it was a social hierarchy. It was a school for Southern gentlemen, modeled on the model of Oxford. It was the Oxford of the South, and everybody wore gowns, everybody that had a certain GPA. I remember they told me what my grade point ranking was. I remember it was like 3.765 or something like that, because I had scored somewhat high on some exams. And so I was there for a little while. The social hierarchy kicked in. I'd never seen anything quite like that. I mean, when I was in grade school, I used to hang out with these black kids and play basketball with them and everything. I remember them very clearly. I remember one of them was named Slick. He was really something. But anyway, I found out that I was what they called a gimp. That is, I was not one of the socially acceptable people because I didn't know how to make small talk. And I didn't know anything about girls. And I didn't have any of the cultural advantages, or many of the cultural advantages the other guys did. They were from the South, most of them, raised with Southern privilege, and I just didn't know how to communicate with them. So we had this thing called Rush, where a lot of people joined fraternities, and I wasn't going to join one, but these guys in one fraternity liked me. There was a bunch of intellectuals in that fraternity, and I enjoyed talking to them. And so they asked me to be in their fraternity, and I didn't have any money, except my dad was paying all my tuition. That was a wonderful thing for him to do. He paid tuition for all of us, and I know we could have gotten some scholarships, and he didn't accept any scholarship. He paid his own way. He never cussed, he never lied, he never drank. He did his job, he worked hard, and he expected you to do the same. So anyway, I got in this fraternity to begin to have some good times and met some people and really liked them and made friends with this guy named Ralph. He became my best friend. I told him about the feelings of longing and beauty and intense beauty, and he'd had the same experiences. I thought I was the only person in the world that had those kinds of experiences, or not really in the world, but I never met anybody that had those kinds of experiences. Anyway, well, I studied hard for about 4 or 5 weeks, and then I just got real tired of it. Plus, I just couldn't take the stress of doing well. It just freaked me out. So basically, I quit studying. And I spent all my time talking to people, and and mostly listening and asking them questions, because by that time I was very interested in why people did what they did, and what is really going on. I thought I was going to major in philosophy because I was really good at philosophy. I had a real knack for it. But after I'd been in philosophy a little while, I saw that philosophy was more oriented toward thinking and reflecting, and not so much on experiencing. And I don't know how I came by this, but two things happened very early on when I was at Sewanee. And they happened as a result of reading the brothers Karamazov. And here are the two things that happened. First, this book solidified my disbelief in God. This book is one of the greatest books, in my view, ever written. This is a fabulous book. Great book. I loved it. I probably read it when I was like 18 or 19, when I was my freshman year at Sewanee. Since I wasn't studying, I was just reading books and talking to people, mostly listening and asking them questions. But anyway, it's about Fyodor Dostoevsky, who's the father, has 4 sons. Ivan the intellectual, Alyosha the saint, Dmitri the passionate one, and Smerdyakov, who is a sort of a monster representing our base nature. And Ivan the intellectual has a conversation with Alyosha the saint. And he says to Alyosha, Alyosha, let me ask you something. Can't remember exact details here, but I got the gist of it. I have never forgotten it. He said, I read in the paper, or somehow he knew this, about a little boy who was put in a privy by his parents, and they smeared him with excrement and they left him there. Now, tell me, Alyosha, you believe in God. You tell me how there can be a good God and let one little child, innocent child like this, suffer. You tell me how you can do that. How can there be a good God? You see, Alyosha, there's really only 2 choices. There's actually 3. I'm sort of making this little piece up, but here's kind of the gist of it. That's actually the way it went. There's either no God at all, or there's a God who has a nice, tender heart, but he's not very powerful. He can't do anything about these little boys in the privies, and there's millions of them. Or he's all powerful, and he doesn't care about them. He likes it that they're in the privy. And Alyosha said, oh, Ivan, you think things like that, terrible things will happen to you. And I thought to myself, what kind of answer is that? That's no answer. That's no answer at all. Ivan is right. Either there is a God, or there isn't a God. And if there is a God, he's not all omnipotent, or he's not all loving. Those are your options, given the way the world is. Period. So that just solidified my belief, or disbelief in God. The other thing was, I thought the second thing I had got from reading Dostoevsky was in his book, The Possessed, which I also loved. I've also read Crime and Punishment and Those from Underground, and another one called The Idiot, which I didn't think was all that great a book. But Crime and Punishment was great, but The Possessed is up here with the brothers Karamazov. It's a great book. And in that book, there's a guy named Kirillov who doesn't believe in God. And he says, if there's no God, there's no law. Now, a lot of people would argue against that. But in the final analysis, if there's no God, then we can do as we please. If there's no God, then I'm free. And this guy Kirillov killed himself to prove it. And that still makes sense to me. And I thought there was a scene in The Possessed where a man is having a duel with another man, and they point their pistols at each other. And at the last second, one of the men has a vision of love. And he lowers his pistol and takes a bullet. And I read that and I thought, that is the way to truth. Intense experience is the way to truth. So I didn't major in philosophy, and I ended up majoring in math because I could do it without studying very much. I barely passed things like French and history where you actually had to study. My brother came a year later, and he could read the grammar rules once and the vocabulary once and ace the test and study for 30 minutes. That'd be the end of it. But I had to memorize, and I had to read them several times and think about them and memorize them, and I just hated it. So I just barely passed some of these courses. I passed them. I don't know how I did it. But anyway, I majored in mathematics. And in my junior year, I really kind of got into the really great mathematics, theoretical mathematics, proof, abstract mathematics, proof mathematics. I took a course in group theory, then topology, and some other courses. Anyway, that's great stuff. But it turned out that the story about the duel was not in The Possessed, as I thought. It turned out it was in The Brothers Karamazov. I discovered that many years later. At the same time, I was talking to the students. And we had this pecking order in the school. And I just refused to talk to anybody above me in the pecking order. There were a few exceptions. There were a few people, quote unquote, that are in the cool fraternities who weren't gimps, and who seemed like good guys to me. And I talked to a couple of those, but by and large, I just ignored them. And but I did talk to a lot of people, and I began to ask questions like, "Where are you from?" and "What do you like?" and "What do you think about this and that?" "What was your family like?" and they began to tell me, and then I began to discover something that just seemed utterly amazing to me. And it still does, in a way. I still get shocked. Not shocked, I just get amazed when I see this. I decided these people would sit there in front of me and parrot back to me their beliefs. You know, what do you think about religion? Or what do you think about the government? Or what do you think about this professor? Or what do you think about the race or black folks and things like that? And they would parrot back the beliefs that they had received through their childhood. And it was most of it was just kind of, a lot of it was kind of rah-rah Swanee, especially among the upper ones, the few that I did talk to. But you could sort of, it was just kind of there everywhere. And I listened to all this, and I decided after a while that by and large, although we do have a degree of freedom, we are heavily socially constructed. And what we think is truth or beauty or goodness is pretty much in our values and our hopes and our dreams are just pretty much created for us by our parents and our upbringing and the experiences of our childhood. Because, you know, I'd already read Freud, so I was just kind of analyzing everything. I read a whole lot of other books too, because all I did was read books, talk to people, and play some sports. So I had a really kind of great time when I was at Swanee, and made some good friends, and I was really pretty happy there for about 3.5 years. It was a great experience, and every night we would go down to this place called Clara's and have a glass of tea and talk. And I got a job in the summer, so I'd have enough money I could buy some tea, and it was a really happy experience in so many ways. I caught the winning touchdown in my junior year of the football game that won the intramural football championship, and then we won the sports championship for the whole year. Our little geeky fraternity managed to do that. It was all pretty nice. Anyway, about a third of the way into my senior year, my friend Ralph Penland had gone down. He graduated. He was a phenomenal mind. He was one of the most brilliant people I'd ever met. And he left. He never studied, but he all got all A's. That's the difference between him and him and me. I could get A's in things like mathematics and philosophy, but I'd have to study everything else. But he didn't study anything. And he went down to Vanderbilt to get a PhD in physics. And I would go down there on the weekends. And one weekend he came up to visit me at Swanee. He says, "I got somebody I'd like for you to meet." And I said, "Okay." By this time I'd sort of discovered girls, and I'd really kind of liked them. And he wanted me to meet this young lady from Florida who was president of the student body at Vanderbilt. And she was also a triple major in history, sociology, and English. A brilliant young lady. And I said I'd be happy to meet her, and I met her. And we had this very intense interaction. And I had never, ever had an interaction like that before. And she began to tell me that she loved me. Well, I'd never told anybody that I loved them. I had no memory ever from my childhood telling anybody that I loved them, my mom or my dad or anybody else. So I wasn't going to say it, but she was so insanely captivating. I mean, she was a blooming genius at getting you to love her. And so finally I began to tell her that I loved her. And then she started talking about dropping little hints about marriage. And so that was a little intimidating for me, but finally, after a little while, after a few weeks of that, I began to sort of get on board with that picture too. And then we went down to Florida to visit her family, and she was from a very wealthy family in Central Florida. Her daddy was a big citrus grower, and I remember going out and looking at the acres and acres of citrus trees. And she lived in a nice big house, and they had an indoor pool. I remember one point I walked past her bathroom and looked in there. She had her own bathroom. When I was a kid, the 6 of us, we lived in a little house in Kansas. We all shared the same bathroom. And I looked at her bathroom, and she had a counter there. It was just filled up with vials of cosmetics and powders and all kinds of stuff. I remember getting this kind of strange feeling about this way of life that I didn't know anything about, almost nothing about. I had seen it among some of the other guys at Sewanee. Sewanee was a men's college, but I'd never gone to visit their homes with these rich young men that went to Sewanee. So I didn't know what their homes looked like. So one night we were lying there in the bed, and she started crying. I said, well, what's wrong? She said, I'm afraid I'm going to do to you what I've done to the others. And I said, well, what have you done? She says, I basically just kind of broke them. I said, oh, don't worry about it. So I got to thinking about that. But actually, from the time I first met her, I had been analyzing her, trying to figure out why she thought the way she did, why she acted the way she did, why she felt the way she did. And I decided, in the basis of my analysis, she had some kind of a little weird relationship with her daddy, and that she was kind of jealous of her younger sister, who was super beautiful. She was the young lady was a good-looking woman, but she wasn't super beautiful like her little sister. And so I just kind of stored that information in my head and thought about it some more when she made this comment about breaking people. And then she began to drop little hints about how maybe we shouldn't get married after all. She drove a big car, and because we were just from 2 different cultures, and I didn't have much of a future, which I didn't, because I didn't know what I was doing. I had no future. I had no plans. I had no ambition. I remember when Jack was in high school, one time he said, well, by the time he came to graduate, or maybe when he was a junior, I don't know, I was there when he said it. He said something, well, I guess I'm just going to try to get through and have a reasonably good time. That was kind of the attitude Jack had, and that was kind of the attitude I had. Except I did kind of want to know what was going on. And so she began to say we wouldn't get married, and she began to talk about one of my fraternity brothers, who was kind of cultured and wealthy. I didn't think he was as good looking or smart as I was, but he had the sort of background she needed. And then this got worse and worse, and finally I went down to visit her one weekend, and the relationship was falling apart. I hitchhiked back up to Sewanee from Nashville. Vanderbilt's in Nashville. It's about 90 miles. I got as far as Monte Eagle, which is about 10 miles from Sewanee. I couldn't get a ride into Sewanee. By that time, it was about 2 o'clock at night. And I walked from Monte Eagle to Sewanee, and in the dark, about halfway there, I started crying. Now, I hadn't cried in many years, and I remember I was saying, I'm so bad, I'm just so bad, and I was crying, and I thought, what is happening to me here? And I got back to Sewanee, and I talked to this good friend of mine named Steve Walker, a wonderful guy from Texas. And he suggested that I think seriously about breaking up with her, and I thought seriously about breaking up with her. And the next weekend, I hitchhiked down to Vanderbilt, and I broke up with her. And she started crying and yelling and telling me that I'd regret it for the rest of my life. And then I never saw her again, except briefly one other time, just kind of by accident on the campus there at Vanderbilt. She wrote a play after that. She sent it to me. It won some kind of contest. And in the play, there was this guy in a tuxedo, and very sophisticated looking guy, except he was barefooted. And he had a pistol in his hand. And I thought to myself, well, she sent it to me because I was the guy with the tuxedo. Tuxedo, reckon, being a person who had a certain amount of charisma, looked good, smart, but cold. I remember in the play, the guy was as cold as ice. and no shoes on, unsophisticated, no background culture to match the tuxedo. So I remember thinking, that's not me. But then over the months that came after that, the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that she was right. That was me. And the more I began to see that that plate glass feeling was still operative. I was experiencing some things on the other side, but inside I was just basically a cold as ice person. And that we had fallen in love with each other, quote unquote in love, because she saw me as the ultimate challenge. And I saw her as someone who finally said they loved me in a way that I could believe. And I did believe it. When she first told me, I believed it. Well, that first semester, that was my first semester my senior year. That first semester I flunked Shakespeare because I didn't read the plays. And I tried to read about 6 or 8 of them the night before the exam, and I failed the exam. So the second semester, I took Shakespeare again and passed it. Made a B, actually. And we read some great plays that second semester. And 2 of them made a real deep impression on me. Oh, one other thing, after I broke up with this young lady, I began to have some violent dreams. And one of them, I was standing on a wall of this fort, and I had a huge machine gun. The chamber was about like this, and the barrel was about this long, and I was just mowing down people by the tens of thousands. It was a powerful dream, a lot of Freudian significance, obviously. And I had another one where I was with some cowboys, and there was a she-fox that was killing, or she-wolf that was killing the sheep or the cattle, and I knew where she was, and we flushed her out and we rode her down with our horses and killed her. And after that, I began to realize that this transition to my father's dominance that occurred after I'd given up on my mom had sort of blinded me to the fact that I was not only screwed up in terms of authority, which I had come to understand after reading Freud, but I was also really screwed up in terms of my relationships with women. I began to reach that conclusion just by analyzing myself, just kind of by noticing the way I acted and the way I behaved. I basically became, around women, sort of an electric personality. I became sort of a magnetic, electric, intensely winsome personality. And I got them to fall in love with me. That's what eventually began to happen. It started. It just gradually emerged. And then after that, I was never happy. Anyway, we read some plays, and the first one we read was this one right here, which to my mind is one of the greatest plays ever written. This is The Tempest by William Shakespeare. Fabulously beautiful. And it has a passage in there. There's this ugly monster called Caliban. He's a stupid, ugly monster. And it's about a man named Prospero who works on enchantment, a magic enchantment. Many years ago, he lost his kingdom. One of his relatives usurped it, and he went into exile on an island. And while there, he works some enchantment and makes this person who usurped his kingdom come back with his son and some other people. And Ferdinand is on the island, who's a monster, and Prospero has a daughter named Miranda who sees Ferdinand for the first time. She's never seen a young man before. I guess she's probably 16 or 17. She sees him and she says, "Oh, brave new world that has such beauteous creatures in it." I was just transfixed by it. Just the wonder of it and the magic and the beauty. And there's Caliban, this ugly monster. But when Caliban sleeps, he has dreams of intense beauty and goodness. And when I read that, it brought back to me those intense feelings of beauty and goodness that I had had when I was a child. It reminded me of what I'd read in Plato in my freshman philosophy course, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, or Wordsworth, Intimations of Immortality, or years later when I read Frankenstein by Mary Bysshe Shelley. That same reality. The very simple question is there any goodness out there? That's the question. And so Caliban would fall asleep and he would dream these things and he would see these things. And then one time he woke up and he says to this guy Stefano who's with him, he said they were listening to these noises, and Caliban says, don't be afraid. The sighs, don't be afraid of these noises. He says, be not afeared. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds methought would open up and show riches, ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again. I read that and I thought, oh my goodness. This is the way the world is. This is something in the world. I got to figure this out. There's another great passage in here too. Prospero weaves his magic, gets his kingdom back. Wonderful things happen. I remembered when I was like about 12, we were traveling from Kansas to Tennessee, and we stopped off. In those days, we didn't never stop at restaurants much. I remember we stopped at one called Pete's Cafe, but we normally took a picnic lunch with us, and we'd stop off at these little roadside tables. There'd be a little open area there in the road, and there was a little table there, and you could stop and have your picnic on your way wherever. I remember we stopped off and we had our little picnic, and